Here we are live on It's My Friday. My name is Scott Stanfield, and I am a modern longevitarian. On today's show, I'm super excited about because I have a fellow Utahn here, and which is, gosh, I think this week I've had people from Utah on, and so he is with Redmond and Real Salt. Darryl Bosshardt, welcome to It's My Friday.
Scott, thanks for having me on the program. I'm super excited to be here with you today.
Yeah, we've been talking for a long time about getting you on the show. Actually, I'm just now remembering live that we were talking when you were in Alaska, actually, about coming on for the Modern Longevitarian podcast. And then just like the other day, I was like, wow, we've got to get you on the live show, and we put this together. So thanks for coming on again.
Absolutely. I am so excited. You know, of all the topics I love to talk about, salt and clay are my two favorites. So glad to be with you today.
Yeah, but the team there at Redmond, which, by the way, you guys may not know this or not, I actually interviewed with Redmond a long time ago and met with the owner, Rhett, and we were just texting last night and was really impressed with the company, but it wasn't the right fit at the right time, and it didn't work out. And so now here we are, and I'm an affiliate for the company. And if you're interested in getting any products or anything, just go down to the comments, and there should be a link in there for you to go and look at these things. But so give me a little bit of history. So what I understand, you know more about the salt mine here in Utah and the history of this than anybody in the company. So tell me what's going on with that.
Well, yeah, so salt is one of the most misunderstood minerals on earth. And people think, salt is boring and salt is salt. And hopefully by the end of our program today, your guests will be half as excited about salt as I am. But my family got involved in the salt business back in the 1950s. My grandfather and his brother had a farm in central Utah, and there was a drought in the 1950s, and the farm wasn't doing all that well, but they knew there was an outcropping of salt north and south of their farm. And so in the 1950s, they dug down in the middle of their farm, hit the salt deposit, and we've been doing salt ever since. So since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, I've been dealing with salt and living around salt. And when my dad said, if you don't straighten up, I'm going to send you to the salt mine, he wasn't kidding. So spend a lot of time with salt.
Yeah. And that's, this is the only salt that natural salt that I know of that's not been highly processed, that's from the US, right? And there's a mine right here in Redmond, Utah, right?
Yeah, when people think of salt in Utah, one of the first things they think of is the Great Salt Lake, and rightly so, because it's a big part of Utah's economy. But what many people don't know is that 2 hours south of the Great Salt Lake, there's an ancient seabed. One of the challenges with salt today, salt that we use on our food comes from the seabed at some point. So it may come from a current ocean, like the San Francisco Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, the Hudson, the Sea of Japan, the Mediterranean. It could come from a dead sea, like the Dead Sea here in Utah, called the Great Salt Lake, or the Dead Sea in Israel, called the Dead Sea.
Right.
Or it could be an ancient seabed, a seabed that was laid down long before we had some of the BP, the Exxon Valdez, an ancient seabed that was around during the dinosaur time frame. And that's the deposit that's in central Utah. It's an ancient Jurassic aged seabed, but sea is consistent regardless of where that sea, it's current ocean, ancient seabed, or Dead Sea.
Right. Salt gets a bad rap. We've been told, like when I grew up in South Carolina, my mom never added salt to anything ever. Right. Then I started working in the restaurant business, and there's kosher salt just flying everywhere. Right. No, not iodized salt, but iodized salt was actually used. It was put on the floor to, like, if the floor had grease on it or was slippery and things like that, but kosher salt to cook with the chefs and things like that. And then this emergence of sea salt has come about over the last, I'd say 5 to 7 years, right, is really where this has happened. And so A is like, how did salt get a bad rap? B, like, how much do we need really? I mean, I've seen studies where like almost 5 grams is the optimum, amount. So if you want to talk about sodium and salt and how much we really need it, I think that'd be helpful for the listeners.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of topics. So I'll start with the first one as far as how did salt get a bad rap? and then we'll try to get into the differences in kosher and iodized and all that kind of stuff. But salt has always been essential for life. If we go back to the times of Rome, and every ancient civilization started around access to the salt deposits, because our bodies as humans and as mammals, we need salt to live. You know, if you've ever tasted your tears are salty. If you've tasted your sweat is salty. And I wouldn't recommend it, but if you tasted your urine, it's going to be salty, because
that's a survival tip in the beginning, right? Yeah, it's like you can't let the bacteria grow, but early on you can do it, right?
Yeah, yep. So our bodies need salt to survive. And so Roman soldiers were actually paid in salt because they could use salt to trade. And so the term, is a man worth his salt, was because you were getting paid in salt. And if you weren't working hard enough, you weren't worth the salt you were getting paid. The term salary is saline and salt based because you were paid a salary, or you were paid in salt. And so salt has always been super essential for life. And if you go into the hospital, you'll get an IV of saline solution, which is salt water, an IV of distilled water, an IV of tap water, an IV of coffee or tea or soda, or an IV of anything but saline solution, which is 0.9% salt, will actually kill and rupture the cells. And so salt has always been super essential for life. And you can't overdose on an IV in the hospital, because the salt is balanced with fluids, and it doesn't have all the other stuff that we'll talk about in a minute that's been attached to salt. So suffice it to say, salt is essential for life, and we absolutely need it for survival. And yet today we hear that salt's bad for us, or like your mom maybe heard back in South Carolina, that we need to reduce and eat less salt. Well, if we were to go back before the invention of the refrigerator, you and I would have both eaten more salt, because we would have had kimchi and sauerkrauts and pickles, and all of our fruits and vegetables would have been pickled and preserved in salt. And the meat that we would have eaten, if it was out of season, would have been preserved with salt. But yet the nature of salt and the foods that we're putting salt on changed as we became more civilized or industrialized. And so a couple of things happened. First, if you look at the ocean water, or the Dead Sea, the Great Salt Lake, those are super saturated bodies of complex chlorides, meaning it's not just sodium and chloride that's in the ocean. If you look at ocean water, we have sodium chloride, which is the main, but we also have potassium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, and then zinc, selenium, phosphorus, iodine, a bunch of other trace elements. But the big one of those is potassium, calcium, magnesium chlorides, which, because of the sodium potassium pump in our cells, we use potassium to process the sodium. And we use these other electrolytes to balance out the sodium in our bodies. So salt companies realized around this same time frame that they could do a series of evaporation ponds. They could take the seawater that occurs at about 3% salt. They could pull it into the first pond, put a different membrane or different liner, leach off the potassium chloride, move it to the next pond, take out the calcium chloride, the next pond, move out the magnesium chloride, and now you can sell the remaining salt as table salt after you've already pulled out these other chlorides. Kind of similar to the milk industry. If I'm a farmer and I can take my raw milk and I can pull out the cream and I can sell that to a dairy to make ice cream and butter, and I sell that first, and now I can still sell the leftover white solution as milk. As a farmer, that makes a lot of sense. As a consumer, I don't want to just buy the leftovers. I want to get the whole product, because the nutritional value, as you know, would be in the fat and the cream. Right. And similar, if citrus, we know that citrus is great in vitamin C and ascorbic acid. But if I were to take a grapefruit or an orange and I extracted all the ascorbic acid and the vitamin C complex, and I sold that as a supplement, and then I still sell the leftover orange, it changes the whole experience, both in the body and economically. And so salt companies started doing that. So the first challenge with processed salt is that oftentimes those other complex chlorides are removed, and what you're buying at the store is actually a refined product. Even if it says sea salt, which doesn't really mean much anymore, because you can have sea salt that comes from the San Francisco Bay, you can pull out these other minerals, add a bunch of chemicals, and still call it sea salt.
Wow.
And so hopefully by the time we're done today, your listeners will ask a few other questions besides, hey, if it's sea salt, it must be good, because your sea salt actually may be C grade.
Wow. Sea salt may be C grade. I might have to quote you on that one, right?
So that's
so this is why they've back in the 1920s they added iodine back to salt because they were stripping everything out of it. Was one of the reasons why?
One of them, but before we talk about iodine, let me mention one more thing that happens to salt. So salt is hygroscopic, which is why at the restaurant you mentioned you would take salt and you'd throw it on the floor because it will, hygroscopic means absorbs moisture. Mm-hmm. And so if you spill a bunch of, cooking oil or whatever, if you throw salt on it, it'll help absorb that oil so you don't get it all over the floor and people don't slip. It also provides some traction.
Right.
But because salt is hygroscopic in nature, if you have a natural salt crystal like this one, this is just a crystal out of the mine here in Utah. If I were to put this on the shelf or on a kitchen table in Florida on a really humid day, the salt crystal is going to look like it's sweating because it's sucking the humidity out of the air, and the salt, the water will actually run off and make a little pool that the salt crystal is sitting in on a really humid day.
Wow.
So if you have that crushed up, then, and it absorbs moisture, it's going to start clumping in the shaker. Mm-hmm. And so salt companies said, hey, we don't want salt to clump. If salt clumps in your shaker, you've got to, kind of tap on it or break it up or throw rice in it. Those are all ways to stop salt from clumping. Well, some chemists got together and said, hey, what can we add to salt? What can we coat the crystals with to stop the salt from interacting with moisture? Now, the problem with that is, as you know, salt in our bodies are supposed to help regulate our body fluids. Right. It regulates the intercellular and extracellular fluids. It regulates sleep. It's essential for cleaning the cells, which is why we urinate and cry and sweat salt. Mm-hmm. So the challenge is they're taking a salt crystal now and saying, what can we do to it to stop it from doing what salt's supposed to do? Mm-hmm. And so they found a whole series of chemicals, things like yellow prussiate of soda, which if you look it up on Google, it's sodium ferrocyanide. Mm-hmm. Another common additive is sodium silicoaluminate, kind of a similar antiperspirant type chemical. And so what they found is you could coat these salt crystals with a series of chemicals, and you, in effect, stop the salt's ability to repel moisture so it doesn't clump in the shaker. So the marketing tagline, when it rains, it pours, and there's a little girl with an umbrella, and she's walking in the rain, and the salt is pouring out of the shaker. It means on a humid day when it's raining outside, the salt doesn't absorb moisture. And so it was this revolutionary thing. Hey, great, the salt doesn't clump. The problem is, once you demineralize the salt, you take all these other important minerals out, and then you cake the salt or coat the salt in a chemical that stops the salt from doing what it's supposed to do, which is absorb and transfer body fluids. Then you eat that. It's no wonder people are having salt problems. And it's a small amount of chemical, but as you know, bioaccumulation is a real thing. And so we strip the minerals, we add all these anti-caking agents, and then we take the salt to make cheap food. So salt's a natural preservative. And so we can add salt to foods we probably shouldn't be eating, and we can make the food last longer by adding copious amounts of salt. And it's not natural salt that we're adding. So not only do we have poor nutrient weak food, but now we're putting processed chemical salt on top of it. And we do a study, and lo and behold, cheap, demineralized, nutrient poor food with copious amounts of salt isn't good for us. Right. But it's not the salt that's the problem.
Right. And before we get into iodine, I just was connecting some dots in my head, right? And this is a gift and a curse, I guess, right? One of my pillars, which you can see right above there, is hydrate, number 3, right? And I've been keto for almost 5 years. January will be 5 years I've been in keto. And through my study about hydration is that 75% of American adults are chronically dehydrated. Now, there's so many things linked to chronic dehydration, and understanding how much salt we really need and how that is an electrolyte and helps us stay hydrated. I'm connecting these dots, right? Could the fact that this low salt movement that's been happening for years, decades, the marketing behind all this stuff, could that be one of the reasons why? And I'm going to ask you to solve the whole public health world here, right? But hypothetically speaking, or my hypothesis is that could low salt be one of the reasons why 75% of the Americans walking around are dehydrated, which is creating things like thick blood and heart disease and all those type of things, right? So, I mean, there's so many things, right, that are going on with that, right? So
yeah, you're absolutely right. And when we talk about hydration, one of the important things to remember is water by itself doesn't hydrate. You need water with the electrolyte. I mean, you can drink copious amounts of water. You can drink gallons and gallons. Actually, what's going to happen if you don't replace those electrolytes, you'll actually die of hyponatremia, because when you drink water, you're still urinating, crying, and sweating out salt water. You don't sweat distilled water. You sweat with these minerals. And so as you rehydrate, you have to have the electrolyte. So, outside of a spiritual discussion, the difference of you and I being alive and visiting one moment and being dead the next is the absence of an electric current outside of the spiritual discussion. And so my hand moves because electricity is moving through my body, telling my hand to move. And distilled water is a very poor conductor of electricity. We need the salt, which is an electrolyte or electricity based, to allow our bodies to have that electric current. And so when people end up on a low salt diet and they're eating natural, one of the things that people miss is as they move to this, better, healthier, more intentional, mindful living, they get rid of their processed foods, which is a great step. But if you get rid of the processed foods and now you're eating fresh, whether that's meats and fats and salads, most people's salt consumption, when they start living and eating more fresh, whatever their diet is, their salt consumption drops. And so then we have indigestion, we have restless legs, we have, a lot of these fibromyalgia or keto flu symptoms that creep in. But it's because
with one of the things you get, right? For sure. Didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's one of the things that's a sign of this too, right?
Yeah. And you mentioned keto, and a lot of people, when they switch to keto, the first thing that typically happens is the glycogen levels drop. And in the body, we have in the liver, we have these glycogen stores. And for 1 gram of glycogen, you typically have somewhere between 3 and 4 grams of water that are attached to that. And so as the body starts, flushing out all of that glycogen as we go into this fasting state, whether that's, for 24 hours or 72 hours or however long, when those drop, one of the reasons we get sick is because we are shedding the fluids, and we can drink water, but we're not replacing those electrolytes that are attached to the fluids. And so one of the things that our bodies crave what we need, right? We feel thirsty usually way later than we should. And sometimes we think we're craving sugar or we're craving potato chips, when in fact, what we're really craving is salt and good, healthy water. So one of the things I try to do at my house is I've got a dish of salt crystals. These are like coarse-sized salt crystals.
Right.
And as I walk past that dish, if you take one of those little crystals and suck on it, most people right away, it tastes sweet. And it's quite satisfying. It actually satisfies hunger pains. It satisfies cravings, because the body typically isn't craving potato chips or sugar. It's craving water and salt. And so that's a great place to start. And it doesn't, break your fast if you just put a little piece of salt under your tongue. And it's surprising, as our salt levels go up, that salt actually tastes different. So that first piece I put in my mouth was very sweet, has a very sweet aftertaste. If I were to do that another 4 or 5 times, by the time I got to the 5th or 6th piece, that piece is probably going to taste a lot more salty and less sweet as my salt levels come up. Same thing with water. After you've ran a marathon, that first glass of water, it's like, wow, that is so refreshing. By the 15th, you're like, oh, that's too much. And our bodies are a lot smarter when we start listening to and having that mindfulness.
Right. And I can attest to that 137%, right? Is that I learned actually Jimmy Moore. I heard him talking about that one point. I don't know if you know who Jimmy Moore is or not, but he's low carb and he's had a podcast called Living La Vida Low Carb and written a book called Keto Clarity and that type of stuff. And I think he was on it was on a podcast. I think Tom Bilyeu's Impact Theory podcast. He was talking about fasting, and he said, he asked like, what do you do if you get hungry if you're doing a long-term fast? And he goes, I just put a pinch of salt under my tongue. And I was like, let me write that down, right? And so what happens is that I'm on record for being intermittent fasting for almost 9 years now, and I actually did a show yesterday on that about how I combine keto and intermittent fasting. And I didn't mention much about salt because I knew we were going to talk about it today. But that is one of the things that I do is like, is for years now, I've been like, if I get hungry and I know that I shouldn't be hungry, it's not the right time, I know my body's craving something else. And I'll start going down this checklist, right? I'll drink a glass of water, right? And if that doesn't work and I'm still hungry, then it's salt under the tongue. Now it's one of my new favorite things on the whole freaking planet right now is this right here, this Relight. And this is made by Redmond, which has 1,000 milligrams of sodium in it, 500 milligrams of potassium, 1585 of chloride, 75 of calcium, and 60 magnesium, right? And so this is, and I'll hold this up to this backwards, so it's hard to get that. This is lemon lime. So this is like stepping back and having that lemon lime Gatorade back in the day, but it has no sugar in it, right? So this is, and this is, as actually says on the canister, his electrolytes redefined. And so I'll have that, right? If the salt doesn't work, I'll have that, because the next thing that could be happening for me would be like, okay, maybe I need some potassium. And that would be if you're on a ketogenic diet, that's typically only going to be an avocado, right? So now I'm like going down the road of having a couple hundred calories, right? When I really want to be fasting. So I'm trying to figure out what my body's craving. And I'll be honest with you, a pinch of just the same thing with you, some salt under the tongue, some real salt from, Redmond. I have, and I'm showing off my stuff here that I have this whole big bag, right? And I'll use that, we use that to cook with. We use that. I actually had a little bit of my salt on my coffee this morning. So there's a little bit in my cup, which Alton Brown from Food Network and Good Eats, he says you should always have a little pinch of salt in your coffee, right, to balance it out. And I've even done that in bulletproof coffees. And I know you're probably not a coffee drinker, but
yeah, I love coffee. And the nice thing about a pinch of salt in coffee is it actually kind of neutralizes some of the bitterness. Mm-hmm. And so it actually makes the coffee a little sweeter. One of the fun things about salt is when you switch to a natural salt, salt shouldn't be this bitter, this sharp flavor. And when you have a sweet salt that's natural, that doesn't have the chemicals added, it has all the other minerals in place, the salt brings out a sweetness and these nuances and flavors in foods and in coffee that you don't get when you put this chemical, really sharp processed version of salt on that food. So not only is the salt that's in a natural state better for you because it doesn't have all those anti-caking agents, it has all of its natural minerals intact, but the third thing is it really makes the food taste better. I mean, food is supposed to be an enjoyment, a fun, bring people together experience. And when you add a natural salt to that food, it brings out these nuances and subtle flavors that's usually masked by that bitter chemical salt taste.
Right. I've been really experimenting with doing some plant-based keto type things, and I end up cooking a lot of cauliflower rice. So if you're on my, my Instagram page, which is really my funny, it's been around for a long time, called @StraightCabbage is my Instagram page. And that dates back to like a long, long time ago. Right. And that's a snowboarding term. It means like that trick was really gnarly. So that was so straight cabbage, man. It was like, and being in Park City, that's kind of where that came from. But, or my Facebook page, I put a lot of those things up there, and I end up cooking a lot because it's rice, quote unquote, a lot of Asian type things. Right. And I find myself, the more I use Redmond real salt, that the less I like putting soy sauce on for the salt flavor on my dishes, because it's like, it's just, like you said, it's just like, it's more in your face. It's just like a punch in the mouth versus it being like, okay, this is a well-balanced dish that you're making. And so I maybe because soy sauce is made with like these refined, stripped down salts. I don't really know, but that's just really, but I'm buying the organic gluten-free version of it, right? And high sodium. Maybe I need less sodium and I can balance it out with Redmond. I don't know, or, with the real salt. I don't know how I can do that, but I'll have to play around with it for sure.
Well, and that might be a good time to switch back gears a little bit. We earlier you mentioned iodine, and one of the things we talked about before the show started, we both like the book by Dr. David Brownstein. He's got a couple of great books. One is Salt Your Way to Health, and then he has another book called Iodine: Why We Need It, Why We Can't Live Without It. And iodine is so important for life, and no discussion on salt would be complete without really talking about the iodine component. So most of your listeners probably think of, when they hear iodine, they think of salt. But if we go back again, years and years ago, that wasn't the case. So how did iodine and salt get linked together? Great question. So if we go back to World War I time frame, we're starting the draft. And in the Midwest, in that time frame, we think about what people are eating. A lot of processed foods, white flour, white sugar. And in the Midwest, not a lot of access to seafood. And one of the highest sources of iodine in the natural diet is kelp, seaweed, dulse, fresh fish, some raw milk products, and there's a few others, but really high in the seafood. And in the Midwest, they were noticing, the government was noticing when they were drafting men, a lot of the men out of the Midwest had a big goiter problem. That's with the thyroid swells, and you've got this iodine deficiency. And they said, we can't draft people out of the Midwest if they have goiter. We've got to figure out a way to solve this goiter issue. And we know it's linked to iodine deficiency. So how can we get people to eat more iodine? And I don't know all of the discussions that took place. I would hope somebody raised their hand and said, well, let's have a campaign on eating more seafood and foods rich in iodine. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer. But what the discussion ended with is, what types of foods that people are eating that could we take and add processed iodine to it and force iodine consumption? Like some municipalities will do that with fluoride today. They'll take fluoride, add it to the water supply to force people to have more fluoride in their diet. So what they found with iodine is they tried to add it to flour. It didn't work. It wasn't very stable. And they ended up with salt. And they could take potassium iodide, add it to salt. It was quite shelf stable. And they found that if they added enough iodine to salt, that it would actually force people to eat, because you have to have salt to live. So if all the salt has iodine added to it, we're going to help solve this problem. And it actually worked. Now, we do find now in additional studies that less than 10% of the iodine that's added to iodized salt is bioavailable. So salt and iodized salt is a really poor version of iodine for the body, because less than 10% of it's bioavailable. But even at less than 10%, by putting 45% of the recommended daily allowance in every serving of iodized salt, 10% is better than 0%.
Right.
And so that's why we have iodized salt today. And when they added this iodine to salt, they created a new regulation, the FDA, that said, unless a salt company adds iodine to their salt, even if seawater occurs with natural iodine, which is why seaweed, fish are rich in iodine. But unless a salt company adds iodine, potassium iodide, to their salt product, they have to put a warning on the shaker or the jar that says, you probably can't read it, but it says, this salt does not supply iodide, a necessary nutrient. And that's because that's the government regulation that says to a salt company, if you don't add iodine, you have to put this warning on your product. What's kind of interesting is natural salt does contain natural iodine in it. Now, it's not your recommended daily allowance, and salt was never meant to be a source of 100% of your iodine any more than it was supposed to be a source of 100% of your fat. So what I suggest, and we talked about some iodine supplements earlier, but most people are probably iodine deficient. And now that's because our food supplies have been demineralized over time. The wheat that we have today has less mineral and nutrient value than it did 100 years ago. People are eating not as healthy. They're eating more of typically the SAD diet, standard American diet, that's demineralized anyway. Our salt's demineralized, our food's demineralized. And iodine is essential for life. If you look at a lot of the tumors, breast tumors, prostate. There's a lot of tumors, and when they look at that tissue, the level of iodine is zero or not, very low or non-existent. And iodine is essential for metabolic health, for so many body processes, from sexual function to diet to so many things iodine plays a key role in, and most people are iodine deficient. So we should all be going out of our way to get more iodine in our diets, whether that's adding some dulse powder, which is a fun thing to do if you're trying to get that soy sauce taste. Add natural salt and then some dulse flakes, which are super high in iodine.
Right.
Or finding a great clean iodine supplement, because we all need iodine, but I would suggest that iodized salt is really not the best place to get that.
It's not, right? And I actually did have a squirt of iodine in my coffee this morning too, right? So that adds to the, my coffee's not the best tasting thing in the morning because it's black, it's got salt and iodine in it, and those type of things. So I go for flavor on Sunday. I'll have a bulletproof coffee and it's got like butter or vegan butter in it and stuff like that. So Sunday's the day I get to indulge. But here's an interesting link, and I'm connecting more dots here. And I've listened to Dr. Brownstein and read his books too, right? And I was listening to him just this morning to refresh my memory on his work. And he talked about how salt is second to water needed in our body. Right. And he said almost every patient that he tests is deficient in salt and deficient in iodine. And I started taking iodine, and I'm not a doctor. I'm not recommending you do this. You got to do your own research, buy some books, go see a doctor, ask them about these things. But I did. And now here's the thing, right? My dots I'm connecting happen to do with the Japanese population, right? Japanese population on average gets about 13 milligrams of iodine in their diet a day, right? The recommended daily allowance here in America is like 150 micrograms, right? So the correlation to that is, what is the oldest living population on the planet that has the least amount of glandular cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, that happens to be in Japan, right? And they're getting 13 milligrams of iodine from their diet a day, no supplements needed, right? They eat a lot of sushi, seaweed, seafood, all those type of things, right? And they have the longest living population with the least amount of cancer that we are now. My dad, the whole reason there's a Modern Longevitarian brand, and I do what I do, is my dad got cancer, prostate cancer, when he was 55 years old, right? 55. Now, you talking about the SAD diet. I had the SSAD, which is a Southern Standard American diet, which is an even worse version of it than what you see in the rest of the world, right? And so salt and iodine are things that, like, and for instance, I heard, Dr. Brownstein say today is like back before the pharmaceutical companies started making medicine, these pills and stuff, is that iodine was one of the most used medicines prior to the pharmaceutical companies having their rise, right? So iodine has been used for years to fix so many different things, and we just don't even realize that we're so deficient in it. So
yeah, and iodine is one that, so if somebody wants to go out of their way to add iodine, and actually this is a product that we're working right now, and we may introduce it here in the future, but in the meantime you can make your own. So if you buy dulse powder, dulse, so iodine is, the reason it's even called iodine is this chemical has a purple or a indigo color. And so the reason that iodine was named iodine, it has this purple indigo color. And if you buy dulse, D-U-L-S-E, dulse is a type of seaweed that has the highest amounts of iodine. That's part of the reason it's purple. And if you buy that powder, you can actually cut it with salt or add it separately. So if you have your shaker of salt, and if you add 15% by weight of dulse powder to real salt, you'll actually end up with about 20% more iodine than you would have in iodized salt. And at 15%, there's like more purple flakes, purple, dusty looking color, along with the kind of that rosy quartz color that are in the natural minerals. But it has a great flavor. And if you bump it up to like 35%, then you actually start to get some of that seawater taste, which again, for the soy taste, it has that. So if you're cooking with, maybe some rice, or you're doing an udon soup, if you add a little bit less salt than you might normally add, say 85% of what you might put in, and then take the balance of that and put it with dose powder,
Mhm.
you'll really boost your iodine consumption and actually get a little bit of that seaweed, seafood, Asian taste.
Mm. Yeah, my daughter, she's 13. She has her own Instagram account. It has like 4,000 followers. It's kids crazy for healthy cooking. And my wife taught her to make this authentic miso soup, right? So, I mean, she literally like puts the kombu in and does and has the tofu and does the whole like traditional and it came from this recipe book that was my mother-in-law's that was this old school time life Japanese, recipe book. And so she's got makes the dashi stock and all those things. And so now I'm like going, how can I get some dolts in that, right? And how can, and really like make this. And one of the reasons, because miso is helps fight with radiation and all that other type of stuff. And we live in this world that has all these, now we got 5G and, and all that stuff going on, right? That type of stuff. But, gosh,
Yeah. I'd
I feel
love
like
to,
I could go ahead.
I'd love to hear how that goes. That sounds like an amazing soup as it is, and then making that basically an iodine meal. This idea that medicine can be our food, especially where iodine was such an important medicine.
Right.
But even go back into the time of, iodine is such an important element, and it's been used for so long, and it's almost been forgotten, or we limit it to this processed iodized salt. But
Right.
with this idea that our food can be our medicine, if you had a great miso soup and you add some dose flakes to that I need to get that recipe from her. I'll have to be one of her new followers.
Yeah. We'll have to figure that out and do it. And what most people don't understand about iodine is that when you look at the periodic table, and we're going back to what 11th grade chemistry here, right? Is it falls in the halide family, and there's 4 elements inside that family. One is iodine, obviously, chloride, and then
Bromide, fluoride.
fluoride and bromide, right? And what happens is bromide and fluoride attach to these iodine receptors and they block iodine reception or absorption, right? And so with that happening, but most people don't realize what bromide, where we get bromide from. We know where we're getting fluoride from. It's in the water and it's probably been in the toothpaste unless you switched out of that. But I grew up drinking, like I said, the SSAD, and that involved in my early 20s before I got in the restaurant world, before I ever had a cup of coffee, I was drinking 6 Mountain Dews a day. All right. A 6-pack of Mountain Dew. There's bromide in Mountain Dew, right? And dough conditioner, right? So if you're eating white bread and pastas and those type of things, you're taking bromide. And years ago, iodine was used as the conditioner for dough, but they switched it over to bromide. And now and if you are eating any iodine and you have bromide in your system and fluoride, is blocking your iodine receptors and you're not absorbing it the way that you should. So you've got to do some research and do a detox and really get that out of your system. And when I started supplementing with iodine, my forehead broke out for like 6 months, right? I had just constant acne on my forehead because I was detoxing that. And now it's like that's all gone away. And when I came through that, detox, I came out the other side and was just like one day I just felt amazing in comparison to how I've been before. So and so it's just really an interesting dynamic that we don't even realize what we're doing to our bodies from the food we eat. And we even say, well, just one time won't kill me. No, it won't kill you, but it may, just layer on what's happening, in this toxic world that we live in and not realize the processed foods do that. Because what happens too is like when you were going back to what I noticed when I really started understanding your body could be craving salt, the foods I was craving at 2 o'clock in the afternoon were like roasted nuts with salt on them, or there'd be bacon sitting in the, on the cooling rack in the kitchen. And I'm walking past that. And so this salty, sweet bacon was something that I was craving. So I was craving these salty foods. And so understanding, what your body's craving and what you really need is really helps you. And it helped me lose weight, right? Because I was now not eating food. I was just, throwing a little bit of salt under my tongue, letting that dissolve and then drinking water and going from there. I feel like we need to transition to a couple other products that you guys have. You also have the clay and different products out of that. Unless there's something you want to add about salt or iodine, if you want to finish that up first, if there's anything.
I would just echo everything you said. If you look at the halogen groups, our thyroids, they love the halogen group. If you look at the halogens on the periodic table of elements, it starts with the smallest particle by atomic weight, and then it gets heavier as it goes down. And iodine is here. You've got chlorine, bromine, fluorine. And because iodine is the biggest, those littler halogens push the other ones out of the way. And so really fascinating stuff. And I love the idea of everybody getting extra iodine, however they want to do that, whether it's eating more seaweed, fish, whatever it is, or finding an iodine supplement. But iodine is certainly important.
Right. And I'm going to echo what Dr. Brownstein says is right. And what you're saying too, is that the best place to get this is from food, right? It's not to supplement it, right? Is to actually get it from the food. And you're right. So eat foods that are high in iodine, and eat foods that are low in bromine, right? And yeah, and
yep.
And that way,
and enriched flour. Enriched flour, I think, is the one that hides in everybody's home. If you buy enriched flour, like you said, it's not enriched with iodine. It's a dough conditioner and it's bromide. And New Car Smell is the same thing. The New Car Smell is bromide that's used in all kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, buy used cars, right? Don't buy. It's everywhere, right? That's why this is a modern longevitarian, because the word longevitarian was actually in a book in the 1850s, 1860s. And I didn't make it up, right? And I thought I did, 8.5 years ago, almost 9 years ago now. And that's how long I've owned modernlongevitarian.com. But it's because we live in this modern world that's completely different than what our ancestors grew up with. Even people who live in the blue zones, they were born in the 1920s, right? They're 1910s, and they didn't have New Car Smell, right? They didn't have enriched flour and those type of things, right? So it's just those type of things there. Let's talk about clay and some toothpaste and those type of stuff. So because we've already talked about the salt, I talked about the Relight, which I absolutely love. I'm going to have to get some more with that. There's my favorite thing. Actually, have been starting for probably the last 2 weeks. Just but so it's like I make this. I have a little bit of magnesium at night when I go to bed, but I've been starting adding a scoop of Relight as I'm going to bed. Right. So I'm getting these electrolytes as I'm going to sleep. Right. And because it's not anything that wakes me up, or it's not a supplement that makes me awake, right? Or those type of things. And so I've been waking up feeling better than what I've been normally. So that may be a hack for people to do. It's like your electrolyte loading as you go to sleep. So,
well, our bodies, as we're sleeping, our bodies are processing, both neurologically processing the day, but also physically, getting rid of not only the food that we've eaten, but also the other things we've exposed ourselves to. And so our bodies at night need great amounts of sodium and water. And unfortunately, maybe, because we don't want to get up and use the bathroom in the middle of the night, we stop drinking at 3 or 4 in the afternoon sometimes, for some people I've heard.
Wow.
And so you're going to bed dehydrated, which stops the body's ability to, cleanse itself, which is it's supposed to do when it's sleeping. And if you don't have the salt, then that's even harder for the body. And so putting a 1/4 teaspoon of salt under your tongue and a big glass of water, or a little bit of Relight right before bed, is a great way to hydrate the cells, because they've got 8 hours, at least 8 hours, hopefully, of cleaning and of processing while you're asleep. And so we've got to give our body a full gas tank, and we don't want to do it with a bunch of food or we're not going to sleep well. But if by giving our bodies water and electrolytes before bed, our cells can purge and clean, and we get up and we urinate and get rid of all of that stuff that our bodies are trying to get rid of all night long.
Right. And I have to plug my book here. I wrote it's a free download. It's called Outstanding Landing: How to Get the Sleep of Your Dreams. I might have to add this into a bonus section about how you should, because I did actually have a bonus section here. It's called Net Hydration, and I talk about, like when you drink coffee, you only get like 80% of the water absorbed. And if you drink alcohol, how it dehydrates you and increases urine production tenfold, and those type of things, right? And I may have to put in a little like how you should electrolyte load going to sleep, right? And put that in there and to do that the right way. But yeah, let's transition. I have, this is, my wife introduced me to this bentonite clay, right? This is like Let's talk about clay and the benefits of this and what you can use it for. It's like remember Big Fat Greek wedding, the Windex. This can be your Windex. I'm telling you, this is insanely important to have in your house. So
as hopefully your listeners have known by now or noticed by now, I am super passionate about salt. I just think salt is the coolest thing in the world, with one exception, and that's clay. And if I had to choose one thing, and I had to either have great Redmond real salt or I had to have great Redmond clay, I would choose clay, because I think there's other good sources of salt. I'm a huge fan of Redmond real salt. I'm a little biased, but there's other good quality salts out there, and there's really just 3 questions I would tell people to ask when they're looking for a good salt. This is the same thing if you're trying to find great anything. Who's producing it? If you can find out who's producing it, then you can find out the next 2. And the next one is, what's the source? Where's that salt or chips or milk or eggs? Where's that coming from? Because that can tell us a lot about the product. And with salt, that's really difficult, because if you go into a grocery store or a big box store and grab a shaker of salt, whether it's pink or gray or white, knowing exactly where that came from, was it the San Francisco Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, the Sea of Japan, that's really important, because our salt and our oceans aren't as clean as they were years ago, and we do have some environmental issues there. But then also knowing exactly, what's been done to it, which is the third. Are they taking anything out? Are they putting anything in? So if you ask yourself those 3 questions, you'll get a good, clean salt. And it may be Redmond real salt. It may be another brand of good, clean, natural salt. But those 3 questions will get you a good product. Now, when it comes to clay, I tell everybody, you shouldn't have kids or grandkids on your property unless you have some clay handy. If we go back, and I love the idea of watching animals and early humans. And if we go back, when an elephant gets hurt, if an elephant, gets hurt, it doesn't run to the vet. An elephant runs to the mud, and it rolls in the mud. And as it draws and the mud dries, it actually draws out thorns and thistles. Cleopatra, and every diva since, has noticed if you put clay on your face, it draws and it pulls. It can lift out impurities. It tightens the pores. It lifts out surface oils. And so every spa in the world uses clay. And if you got stung by a bee in South Carolina, if you got stung by a bee in South Carolina years ago, grandma would tell you to go get some mud and put mud on it, because as the mud dries, it draws out and pulls out that infection. And so using clay topically has been since the dawn of time. We can go back and look at the Persians, the Romans, all of these ancient warriors would take clay with them. And in fact, even today, the U.S. military uses a product called Cool Clot or Quick Clot. And if you have a hole in your side, you actually pack it with Cool Clot or Quick Clot, because clay stops the bleeding faster than about anything else. And so Cool Clot is a product that's bentonite clay and kaolin clay mixed together, and they can lace it with gauze or put it on raw, and you put it right in, and that stops bleeding.
Right.
And this is just clay. And so it's really amazing how clay can be used. So topically, lots of uses on clay. There's a lot of great resources on clay, and clay is also a great base for toothpaste, because it's a great polisher. It's very alkaline, and so it settles off the mouth acidity. And so we use clay topically for facials. We have people that use it, as poultices, and then it's also a great base for toothpaste, because it's alkaline. It settles off the acidity. It's a great polisher. It binds to impurities, which is why it's used for so many reasons.
Right. Well, for all my friends that may be watching this back in South Carolina, all those mosquito bites that we don't have to worry about here in Utah in the Rocky Mountains, it'll draw out that, or the fire ant bites, right? It'll draw that out. Now, the last time I was stung by a bee was actually here in Utah, because this is the beehive state. And so, yes, it hit me right on the cheek, right? And you put that right on there, right? And it'll do that. It reduces swelling, right? You twist an ankle, it can draw swelling out that way. If your teenager has acne, it can help with those type of things. Facials for a day spa trip to your bathroom, right? You want to put it together, right? And I think Cleopatra used raw apple cider vinegar mixed with her clay, right? When she did that, is what I've read, right? I never met her, right? But that's what that happened, right? But no, it's like I said, this is, and we take it on us with us on hikes. I guess like just like the you can take and pre-mix it, right, and have it in a Tupperware container or a sealable container, so it won't dehydrate because it's not a lot of humidity here in Utah, and we take it with us in our emergency pack when we go hiking. It's super important, super important.
I used to keep bees. I sold my bees a few years ago, and I had several beehives here, just south of you. And every time I went to the beehives, I would take clay with me. And if I found if I got stung by a bee and I didn't put clay on immediately, I just, let's say I finished what I was doing, went home, 2 hours, 3 hours later, I put the clay on. It feels good, but it doesn't stop the swelling. But if I put the clay on right immediately after that sting, then I wouldn't get near the lump. I'm slightly allergic, so if I got stung and waited, I'd have these massive, like, goose egg looking spots where I'd get stung.
Wow.
But if I got the clay on there soon enough, I didn't have that problem. And then growing up in southern Utah, we had tons of mosquitoes, and so we always used clay for mosquito bites.
Yeah. It's and that's what you said. My wife, when she was telling me about this, she said you can watch animals, and if they're not feeling good, they'll go to a puddle of water and they'll drink the water that has clay mixed in it and dirt mixed in it, and that'll help them, do that. And then, even like ancestral tribes would carry balls of clay with them, right, and do that. And so, just like you just the same thing with salt, right? You're a man that's worth his salt, also probably a man could be worth the clay, right? It's just that important. And so where is the I mean, I know that there's the Redmond mine, the salt is in Redmond, Utah, right? Where's the clay actually mined here in Utah?
So that comes right from the same area. So there's 7 different types or kinds of clay, and I wouldn't suggest you just go start, using any type of old clay. This particular clay is a cementite clay, and it's called either montmorillonite or bentonite. This particular clay is weathered volcanic ash. And so you've got this seabed that was laid down 150, 250 million years ago, according to geologists. I wasn't alive back then. I can't confirm the actual day. A long time ago. And then above this salt deposit, there's a layer of this volcanic ash-based clay. And this particular clay has been written about. We learned about using clay like this from a book called Our Earth, Our Cure. It was a French naturopath, Raymond Dextreet, whose book was translated into English in the 70s as the health food movement started to take off. And so these health food people came into our office and said, hey, we have done some research, and we think the clay that you have is this same type of French clay that this naturopath said would work for all kinds of things internally and externally. And since then, there's been a lot of great research on clay. I know Wikipedia is kind of a truth by committee, so some people really like it and some people really question it. But if you go to healing clay or medicinal clay on Wikipedia, there's actually a really good summary of all the different ways clay's been used. If you look back at the original product called kaopectate, that might be too old of a product for some of your listeners, but kaopectate was used almost universally, like you might use Pepto-Bismol today. Right. Stomach aches, indigestion, vomiting, diarrhea. Kaopectate was kind of the go-to for stomach. And the original formula for kaopectate was kale and clay and pectin. And so, as you point out, if you ever watch Nova or some of these late night natural nature shows, there's a show you'll see with these parrots in South America, and they will eat toxic berries and then they will eat clay, and the clay actually neutralizes that. If you watch an animal that gets sick, the animal gets sick, it seeks out and eats clay. In fact, clay, most dairy farmers, maybe every's an overstatement, but dairy farmers will feed their livestock clay because clay is a natural toxin binder. We can't sell it for humans that way because there hasn't been enough studies and all of the pharmaceutical attached to it. But if you're a dairy farmer and you start feeding your cows clay, their somatic cell count, the bacteria count in the milk drop, their health in the hoof increases, the calf rates increase because that toxin load drops. if you own a bird sanctuary, here in the West particularly, we have a problem with birds of prey eating animals that have been shot with lead bullets, and then the animal gets lead toxicity. And so these bird sanctuaries will feed the birds clay, because when they feed the birds clay, the levels of cadmium, mercury, lead decrease. And there's some great studies on fish for the same reasons. Some of the places that fish are, especially inland fish, like the Great Salt Lake, we know has high levels of mercury. And so what they've found is if they feed tilapia and carp, and some of these studies have done on fish, if they feed these fish clay, it actually removes the levels of heavy metals in the bone, the brain, and the tissues. So it's really cool stuff. And these studies are all on animals that they've done, birds of prey, fish, rodents, and they've noticed that those toxin levels drop. In dairies, they use clay for that. And historically, humans did too. There just hasn't been enough studies on it to make those claims in humans.
Right. Yeah. It's really, really interesting. And by the way, I mentioned earlier that your spelling of your name was like Dale Earnhardt and Dale Earnhardt Jr. earlier. I didn't tell you that I used to race go-karts, and I did for 15 years. And part of my career, I raced on these red clay dirt tracks. And so if any of my racing buddies are watching this from back in the Southeast, this is not the red clay we used to race on. Don't go to the track and like take a spoon and go out there and do that. This is a whole different ball game, right? And so this is bentonite clay is what you guys have here, and it's but it's next level stuff. And I'm not saying that clay wouldn't work if you got a mosquito bite and you wanted to put it on there and do that. It just this is a different and I didn't know it was volcanic ash, which is if I did, I may have forgotten that, but that's which is rare. I don't really forget many things, but that's super cool. So we're getting close to an hour here, Darryl. I want to thank you for coming on. Obviously, I put in the comments my affiliate link, and I will make a couple pennies if you click on that and go buy, the Relife or the salt or those things. So, but real briefly, what about if there's a chef that comes across this or somebody who owns a restaurant? You said you can check and be a wholesale customer by going through that link as well, right?
Yeah, correct. Yep. We're happy to set up a restaurant. We have 25-pound bags and 10-pound buckets of salt for more culinary and back of kitchen use. Of course, we're happy to have, salt on the front of the house as well. And what we find when you use natural, one of the questions we get, will I use more or will I use less? And that really kind of depends on the food. But what we find is when you switch over to that natural salt, you'll notice that your coffee tastes better, your food tastes better. And it's because it's bringing out these subtle nuances and flavors. And it's that sweet salt flavor, the way the salt was meant to be savored, that we've now associated with this bitter, oh, that's too salty. Salt should have a nice sweetness to it when it's the right salt on the right food. But I really appreciate taking the time with me to visit today, Scott. It's been a lot of fun, and maybe we can do it again sometime. But really appreciate your hospitality and letting me talk about salt and clay.
It's been my pleasure. We'll wrap it up right here, and I'll reach out to you later about some other things we talked about. But I just wanted to say really thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Scott.
All right. Take care. All right. I just want to say thank you to my partners at broadcast partners at Spiritual Mild. It's been super fun having Darryl on today, a company here in Utah, and a salt that is mined here in Redmond, and they've been on clay. And again, go to my website, strongforlonger.com. My name is Scott Stanfield. I encourage you to get the best sleep that you possibly can by downloading the book. And it's called Outstanding Landing, How to Get the Sleep of Your Dreams. And this show is called It's My Friday. And if it is your Friday, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Cheers.